Father Cartier has encouraged me always to say at the beginning of any of these discussions what the overall theme is, and this week's is really very simple but also sobering. We saw last week how the result of discovering Enlightenment principles was that both toleration and democracy made their appearance as being guiding truths of the West. This week, the Enlightenment is going to take it back, is going to change its direction, with the result that we have been headed into a totally different trajectory since the dawn of the 20th century. This change occurred principally during the 19th century, as we'll see. At first, it's not easy to trace, but once you see it, its results then become understandable. You'll see on page 1 that I've set out a model of the religious system of Christianity for the modern period. The result of Catholics and Protestants being able to agree to disagree was that a new model emerged. This new model put a ritual emphasis upon community, and the language of community steadily grows right the way through the Enlightenment period. And by putting that ritual emphasis there, it means that one community can have a different set of rituals as compared to another, and yet they can remain in contact. Catholics and Protestants can talk. Protestants can count up differing numbers of sacraments or none, as long as they focus on the issue of community. And then in the other two aspects of the system, there was an agreement that sense had to be made out of the reality of Christ within these religious systems. The issue was not so much orthodoxy as it once had been, because after all, differing orthodoxies had emerged during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Now you found people asking questions about Jesus from a purely historical point of view, as well as from the point of view of the emergence of doctrine. And then finally, in the field of ethics, what Enlightenment Christianity asked of all believers was the integrity of their belief. So the issue fell much more on commitment than either on dogmatic concerns or on the Protestant view that ethics comes out of faith. Now the issue was integrity, pure and simple. As long as there was an agreement that a single view of reason animated this entire system, that first step in the Enlightenment that we spoke of last week appeared to be a permanent level of progress. One of the major figures in establishing this was the French mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal, as you can see over on page 2. In his Pensées, his thoughts, which were actually published just after his death, you see Pascal setting out an understanding of faith that reflects this model of Christianity I just discussed as being as clear as a mathematical theorem. Let us consider that since the beginning of the world, the expectation or worship of the Messiah has subsisted without interruption. That there have been men who said that God had revealed to them that a Redeemer who would save his people would be born. That Abraham came afterwards to say that it had been revealed to him that he would be born of him by a son that he would have. that Jacob declared that among the 12 children he would be born of Judah, that Moses and the prophets came afterwards to announce the time and manner of his coming, that they said that the law which they had was valid only until the coming of the Messiah, that until then it would be perpetual, but that the other world would endure forever, that thus their law, or that of the Messiah, of which it was a promise, would always be on earth, that in fact it has always lasted, that finally Jesus Christ came in all the foretold circumstances. That is admirable, which is Pascal's way of saying QED. Now, do you notice within this entire discussion the very clear focus on Christ, on the Messiah, as I was saying within the discussion of our model? That became emblematic of discussion during the time of the Enlightenment. And you also see very clearly that there is an emphasis on the way in which differing communities would understand the relationship between law and the coming of the Messiah according to their own view of ritual. There is no trace in Pascal of what we're going to see emerging later. No trace of the view that the reason you use for mathematics is different from the reason you use to investigate God. Because as far as he was concerned, there was only one reason. And this was also the view of his successor, Isaac Newton. Newton spent more time as a commentator on the Bible than he did writing about gravity. We now know this is the case because we actually have access to his notebooks. You can see them on the web if you dare to try to decipher his handwriting. They are very handily available. And among his notes, when he's writing on the book of the Revelation of John, his favorite subject, you can see his clear passion for the notion that reason is unitary. If you can come down to the root of things, you will find simplicity. And so he wrote, "As the world, which to the naked eye exhibits the greatest variety of objects, appears very simple in its internal constitution when surveyed by a philosophic understanding, and so much the simpler by how much the better it is understood, so it is in these visions. It is the perfection of God's work that they are all done with the greatest simplicity. He is the God of order and not confusion. And therefore, as they that would understand the frame of the world must endeavor to reduce their knowledge to all possible simplicity, so it must be in seeking to understand these visions." In Newton's mind, when you correctly understood the apocalypse, you could see the unfolding pattern of history and how it was that human knowledge was increasing. He even came to the conclusion that because of the advance of human knowledge of God, it was possible for him to understand gravity where others had not. Considering the vacuum of space, how, as he understood the vacuum of space, now of course that would be challenged, but when he considered the vacuum of space, he called the connections between bodies in the universe instrumentum Christi, the instrument of Christ, the strength which holds the entirety together. There's no hint whatever of his trying to divide reason from faith. It's quite the opposite. Faith and reason operate together because they are a signal human cognitive function. And this became a basic understanding of the Enlightenment. It's the foundation of what I was saying about Jonathan Edwards last week. That's why Edwards, the great preacher of the awakening of the 18th century, was also an eager reader of Isaac Newton, and why Jonathan Edwards himself was a corresponding member of the Royal Society in London on the topic of spiders. It all fell together. When Edwards spent his 13 hours a day in his study, yes, an average of 13 hours a day, it was not only to consider theology and scripture, but also what was then called natural philosophy. And other polymaths also ventured away from their usual terrain. An example would be Benjamin Franklin over on page 3. Ever wonder what his creed was? He said so in so many words, writing to Ezra Stiles, who was at that time the president of Yale College. Here's my creed. I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I regard them as you do in whatsoever sect I meet with them. This attempt within the Enlightenment to find a single agreement within the denominations is quite striking. Isn't it ironic that Benjamin Franklin uses the adjective fundamental in this context? By the end of the Enlightenment, we see fundamentals emerging in quite a different context. Why should this have occurred? It occurred because reason broke. It went in differing directions. One can begin to see this in the work of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who argued that when we reason about what we see, that is a different form of logic as compared to when we reason about what is right. And likewise, religion appeared to have a different kind of religion as compared to the perception, say, of natural philosophy or politics. So consider the statement by Hegel, which I quote from his Relationship of Religion to the State, 1831. The state is the true mode of actuality. In it, the true ethical will attains actuality, and the spirit lives in its true form. Religion is divine knowledge, the knowledge which human beings have of God and of themselves in God. This is divine wisdom and the field of absolute truth. But there is a second wisdom, the wisdom of the world. And the question arises as to its relationship to the former divine wisdom. There's one way of thinking about the state. There's another way of thinking about God. Another way of thinking about science. Another way of conducting one's own life. Hegel goes on to express the view that finally it must be that these two wisdoms he speaks of, the wisdom of God and the wisdom of politics, must come together. Of course, his colleagues across the Atlantic during this same period profoundly disagreed and insisted that these two reasons would be separate in order to be healthy. But when you open the possibility that you can think through religion in its own terms without having to be concerned about natural philosophy, without having to be concerned about politics, it means that you can begin to discover divine truth in Scripture separate from everything else. And that's precisely what occurred during the 19th century. And I give the example of John Nelson Darby on page 4, who is a founder of a movement called dispensationalism. The concept of dispensationalism was that God had been revealed in distinct covenants that he made over time. So there was the covenant that he made with Adam, the covenant with Noah, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Israel, the covenant with the Gentiles, he means Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire, the covenant with the church, and finally the millennium, when the saints would ultimately rule. And what was fundamentally important for John Nelson Darby was that this millennium had not yet occurred. He openly contradicted the interpretation of St. Augustine many years earlier. Augustine taught that we are living in the millennium, that when people are free from Satan, they are millennials. You don't have to be born in 2000 to be a millennial. You're a millennial by the fact that you live without Satan. And Augustine argued that's precisely what makes us new creatures in history. Darby opposed this. Darby said, no, we are not yet in the millennium. We have to await a cataclysm, that moment when some are going to be left behind. Sound familiar? The left behind scenario comes from John Nelson Darby in the 19th century, and it's invented by taking the basic scenario of the Revelation of John and introducing a completely new element. The new element is not in the Revelation of John. It comes from a letter of Paul. In the first letter of Paul to the Thessalonians, Paul assures his readers, don't be troubled at the thought that some people have already died. When Christ comes in judgment, he is going to meet them first. And then he will come to the rest of us who are left behind. In other words, Paul speaks these words in order to give assurance that if we've lost those we loved, they are going to be restored to us in the encounter with Christ, and they will enjoy that encounter first. But when you start taking a passage from one point in the New Testament and insert it into another, you can reverse its meaning. And so in this case, left behind came to mean not those who are alive, who are going to be restored to Christ, but left behind in the sense that they're never going to see Christ. It basically falsified Paul's meaning in the course of inventing a new kind of logic for reading the Bible. But once that occurred, the Enlightenment had basically staked its claim on this notion of fragmented reason. Reason running off, each in its own direction. Ironically, an investigator who sought to represent the old view of reason was the very one whom we associate with the civil war between religion and science, namely Charles Darwin, a very talented student, University of Cambridge, studied theology, was a keen reader of William Paley, an 18th century theologian. We know he was a keen reader because we have his bedside copy of Paley's Natural Theology, and we have the annotations that Darwin wrote. We also know that Darwin very much wanted to be for biology what Newton had been for physics. That was his model. And his theory on the origin of species by natural selection was designed to secure him that place. As he saw it, he was operating within Newton's view. And so he said in the close of On the Origin of Species, "Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity," acknowledgement of Newton, "from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." 7 months after the publication of these words, there was a debate that occurred at the University of Oxford between a biologist, Thomas Huxley, and a bishop, Samuel Wilberforce. That's usually taken to be ground zero of the creationism evolution debate. In fact, the position of the two men concerned was a little bit more interesting than that. Neither Wilberforce nor Huxley thought Darwin was right. And as a matter of fact, most scientists who read Darwin did not believe he was right, because they couldn't understand how it would work, as Darwin claimed, that you would have a gradual change over time until one species would become another. There wasn't the underlying theory that would enable you to grasp that. The only reason evolution won the day, almost a century after the publication of The Origin of Species, was that genetic science had been born. And it was possible to understand how a single organism can carry within its genetics traits which are not obvious. I have a trait for carrying hair. You would never know that, but it's true. And because that is the case, because of these multiplicity of traits which are in fact invisible symptomatically, the science of evolution was born. But as Darwin did it, it wasn't like Newton's science. He couldn't measure evolution. He couldn't prove evolution. It actually was not a theory. It was a hypothesis based upon observation. Both Huxley and Wilberforce knew this. But at the end of the day, Wilberforce objected to it, not on the grounds of science, but because the idea of the survival of the fittest could be applied in political contexts, and so result in justifying the idea that you should give no aid to the poor. Wilberforce was representing an opinion very much like that of another Anglican clergyman earlier, Jonathan Swift, who wrote in his modest proposal, "Okay, you great capitalists of London, you believe in survival of the fittest, you don't want to do anything for the Irish question? I have an idea. Why don't we sell Irish children to be eaten?" That was his modest proposal. Before there was Darwin, there was what we call social Darwinism. And many of those who were engaging with On the Origin of Species had that in mind. And then on Huxley's side, as I said, he disagreed with Darwin in matters of detail on the science, but he saw in Darwin the possibility of arguing against Wilberforce that science alone can explain reality, and if you can't demonstrate the existence of God, then you shouldn't say that you believe in God. He popularized use of the term agnostic, which sounds great until you bear in mind that he also did not believe that Darwin's theory worked, and yet he was willing to argue for it. So you have a scientist who's willing to be faith-based when it comes to science, and to criticize faith when it comes to theology. This became the characteristic problem of the Enlightenment. People taking their own particular kinds of logic and assuming that they were competent to speak of other fields of experience. It goes on to this day. Richard Dawkins, a biologist from Oxford, is very uncertain how one species can possibly move to another. This is still a problem in evolutionary science. Very uncertain about that, but he knows for a certainty that if you speak the language of God, that's nonsense. And John Polkingham, a professor of theology at Oxford, is very certain that scientists are speaking outside the realm of their competence, even though he acknowledges that he's not sure how theology and natural philosophy should work together. That debate between religion and science has been endlessly repeated. And anyone looking for an idea for a book that will sell, write on that subject. There's always someone who thinks it's new. But in fact, the basic problem is being repeated, and that problem was exacerbated. Exacerbated by two major developments within Catholicism on the one side, within Protestantism on the other side, which attempted to insulate faith from any kind of discussion with scientific or historical authorities. So the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. This is not Jesus. The Immaculate Conception is not the same as the virgin birth. Virgin birth refers to Jesus' birth. Immaculate Conception refers to the birth of Mary, his mother, without sin. An idea which had become popular in the Middle Ages, but which had never been elevated to the point of being doctrine within the Catholic Church. But it became doctrine in 1854. 1854. 5 years before the origin of species. Pius IX declares the Immaculate Conception. And then he made another move which is related to this. There was a meeting of authorities of instruction within the Catholic Church in what's called the First Vatican Council. Very much a different affair from the Second Vatican Council, which we'll encounter next week. The First Vatican Council saw Pope Pius, the same Pope, going before his colleagues in the College of Cardinals and saying, "When I said that Mary was immaculately conceived, I was infallible, wasn't I?" That is, in 1870, there was articulated the view that when the Pope speaks on a matter of doctrine for the Church, he speaks infallibly. This is not a medieval doctrine. It's not an ancient teaching. It comes from the modern period. It comes from a period of a fractured reason where you start logically thinking only about a very narrow range of evidence. And this power of infallibility has since only been used once by Pope Pius XII. They had a kind of challenge of finding names during the same period. In 1950, also infallibly declared that the mother of Jesus had been assumed into heaven at the time of her death. Therefore, distinguishing Roman Catholicism very clearly from other forms of Christianity, both in the matter of Mary and in the matter of the powers of the Pope. Was Protestant Christianity going to stand still with claims of infallibility going on? It was not. And so we saw the movement fundamentalism emerge. Fundamentalism, a term which is used very widely right now, somehow it's been associated in popular imagination with any form of literalism. We're about to see it's really quite different from that. Literalism is only natural. Most people read things literally when they first encounter them. Doesn't disturb me when they do. As long as they're willing to read a second time, it's fine with me. You learn over time to become imaginative. You gradually understand what a metaphor is. Fundamentalism didn't have to be invented as a term to explain the reflex of literalism. Fundamentalism is rather the statement, which was first founded by a scholar named Benjamin Warfield at Princeton University. Fundamentalism was originally called the Princeton theology. I like to remind my colleagues of Princeton that from time to time. And the concept was, just as Darwin has his laws of evolution, we have laws of the Bible. Now note well, these laws of the Bible are not actually stated in the Bible. These laws of the Bible are understood to be axioms that you need to understand the Bible. So the first is, it's the Bible that's infallible, inerrant. There are no mistakes in the Bible. By the way, you cannot be a literalist and believe that. Jesus can only have said one set of words at the very end of his life, right? And yet the Gospels record different words. There are different versions of the Exodus. You have to decide which is the inerrant one, and make the other passages conform to it. So it's not literalism. It's an attempt to say we're going to find a way to see this as being infallible. The second fundamental is Jesus' birth of a biological virgin. That's not literal either, because Jesus is called in so many words the son of Joseph in the New Testament. There are different views of Jesus' birth in the New Testament. Fundamentalism is taking one of them. Another, Jesus' performance of miracles that defy natural law. You have built into the idea of the fundamentals the rejection of natural law, which obviously is not a part of the biblical world. They had never encountered a natural law in the biblical world. Jesus' atonement for the sins of others by shedding his blood in payment for sin. This is not an idea which is stated in the Bible. It was overtly articulated by an Archbishop of Canterbury, St. Anselm. And then finally, that Jesus' resurrection occurred in the same body in which he died, even though St. Paul says that everyone resurrected is resurrected in a transformed state. In other words, fundamentalists are determining which views they're going to say are infallible and wishes to bring about a coordinates of all commentary so that the fundamentals remain with the truth of natural law. So you have fundamentalists insisting that they have the single view of Christianity which is valid, Catholics asserting infallibly that they have understood this, scientists saying that both sides have got that wrong, and also in the early 20th century a growing number of political ideologies which said that they alone comported with the very nature of man. No one could have reasonably expected that the 20th century would go well. And it did not. Thank you very much. Yes, please, Rosalie.
The whole issue of science and religion is very interesting, of course. And in the 20th century, there are a number of mystical orders that are approaching that. The Dalai Lama has written a book on the world according to the atom. I'm not getting it. I've just recently read it, but I don't have the title right. And in other mystical forms, and there are physicists working with living mystic masters that are approaching that. There are real attempts to make a synthesis of the two.
Mm-hmm. There are, without question, as the questioner remarks, I'll repeat for the sake of the Cardinal Redhook, attempts to bring together religion and science. What I wish to point out is that this line of cleavage between religion and science is only the most obvious symptom of the problem. The underlying problem is the use of one kind of reason as if it is automatically going to be applicable to other ranges of human experience. It happens sometimes on a more local scale when a writer does very well, let's say, in a particular sort of writing, and therefore assumes, oh, I can jump over to the other side. Richard Dawkins says, I can do theology. Doesn't actually work. And the problem is not only the natural hubris of all writers, which is an axiom of nature, but also the fact that we have this sense, on the one hand, that we protect the kind of reason that we use in our particular areas rightly. I mean, if I want to understand a verb in Aramaic, I really need to think in Aramaic terms, and that's all I can do. If I start thinking Greek, or I try mixing this up with another kind of analysis, the result is not going to be good translation. So to some extent, we have to accept the simple fact that our reason is actually determined by the kind of work we're doing, whether it's physical or linguistic or historical or scientific. But then once we've honed that product of reason for that purpose, then it's not appropriate for us to assume that we can simply apply it within another area. But then there's another element to this, and it is that even as we acknowledge the distinctive nature of the reasons we have to deploy, and I think we all naturally deploy these different kinds of reason. We think about our children differently from the way that we think about other relatives. We think about them differently from the way we think about neighbors. We think about them differently from the way we think about people with whom we have a professional relationship. That's normal, that's right, that's civilized. But it then does raise the question, how are these differing ways of reasoning about people related to one another? And there, I think, is where the Enlightenment has really run into its crisis. It is spoken about reason sometimes as if it were universal and applicable to everything, and then it refers to it as if it has to be honed for particular cases, and that is bound to result in a misunderstanding.
And it's also said that with true mystics, they usually, those that know don't speak.
Yeah, true mystics don't speak, and that's why sometimes they can't contribute much. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
Is this a QED that our understanding of God on this planet is going to be very limited?
Yes, that's a very good observation. That one of the ways in which Christian theology over millennia in differing systems agrees is in saying that our perception, when it becomes as acute as possible, is only a partial perception. And this, interestingly, is a way in which a theologian speaking honestly about his craft and a scientist speaking honestly about his could actually agree. So Newton, famously at the end of his life, having been blessed with many, many different honors and given a wonderful job by the Parliament in London. He actually ran the Royal Mint. I mean, this is pretty good, you know, for a scientist from Trinity College. At the end of his life, he is interviewed, and he said, "I've been like a child playing on the seashore. I've only understood some of the first principles that are most obvious, and there's an entire ocean out there waiting for me." A theologian could say precisely the same thing. And in their willingness to acknowledge uncertainty, they would be a much more fruitful ground for meeting than in trying to tell one the other why you can't say that. Yes, please.
Where does inductive and deductive reasoning fit into this?
Mm-hmm. The distinction between two kinds of reason, inductive and deductive, fits in because within the field of science itself, most would prefer to have a deductive system. That is, where I can run an experiment. I can falsify a proposition or confirm a proposition by setting the experiment up. It's either going to agree with my prediction or it's not. The problem is that you cannot always deduce principles from immediate empirical evidence in that way. You can't do that in the field of science. As I said, initially speaking, Darwin had no experimental evidence that he could possibly use. Even today, the experimental evidence that supports evolution is on a genetic level. And there's still this issue of how species change can occur. What brings that about? No one has successfully made that happen. And as a result of that, in addition to deduction, that is, I have my evidence, I take my results, induction involves our understanding by inference that there's a connection between events, which we cannot experimentally establish, but which works reliably enough for us to incorporate that as a matter of theory. In practice, almost all historical knowledge is inference. You know, I cannot run an experiment which will tell me about Henry VIII's motivations. All I can do is look at the evidence and infer on the basis of that what it was likely he was able to achieve. So the mix of deduction and induction is going to change according to the field of inquiry in which you're operating. That's an example of the way in which we understand that these are different kinds of reason, and yet they're mutually reinforcing. And in most of our activities, we move from one to the other. It can be helpful to know when we're doing so, but we don't always watch our induction and our deduction as we might. Yes, please.
Yes, I was speaking to you before about how troubled I am by people who see salvation as somewhat limited and achieved through faith. But as you're saying, we can know so little in this ordinary life. And it seems to me that in the life after death, you would learn a great deal more, and we probably all learn more about each other's faith, and we Christians would probably learn some stuff from other people. But I mean, that's one reason that seems to be so brutal. The idea that within this limited amount of knowledge that we have here, that God could make a judgment and say, all right, with such limited ability to experience even other cultures that are right around us, that we could be said to have had enough faith or not enough faith to make the cut. That seems
Yeah. No, I think we were talking earlier, and I pointed out that this was noticed during the Reformation, namely that if you say to people, I know who's going to be saved, and you're not, the results of that claim are often very destructive And in addition to that, the speaker who says that is putting himself, by definition, in the position of God. The simple fact is that the decision of who is saved and who is not saved is above the pay grade of anyone in this room and any person outside this room. Even those who claim to be infallible, they don't get to make the choice. I would have thought it was fairly plain from the most rudimentary, even literal reading of the New Testament, that choices about final judgment belong in the hands of God alone. This has been very clearly established since the Reformation. Within the Anglican Church, you happen to be in an Anglican context, so I mentioned this. Within the Anglican Church, it's one of the 39 articles that you don't do that. Yet, people sometimes do what they shouldn't do. And we can only by induction figure out what might be motivating them. Yes, please.
A psychologist named Dr. Barr, famous at college, has conducted experiments with young people all the way through the elderly about how we think. And what he has discovered is that we take external impressions and appearances to be real because we have an inborn lazy brain. We will not go beyond the obvious or ask questions. So it supports your position.
Excellent. This theory of the lazy brain is one that I haven't heard before, and I'm sure it must be right. It reminds me of a frequently told story in my family. When my father was growing up, my father and my grandfather did not always get along exactly well. Both what you might call strong personalities. And then one Sunday, my grandfather surprisingly said, "Bruce," my father's also named Bruce, he said, "Bruce, you are going to invent some great labor-saving device." My father said, "Gee, Pop, thank you. Why do you say that?" He said, "Because you're the laziest person I've ever seen in my life." and then the argument resumed, you know. And I actually think, the reason I say this, I actually think that laziness, trying to get around work, figuring out something simple, signs of intelligence, all to be supported. Of course, as a teacher, I have to find ways to fake students out of doing that and get them to do what they need to do, actually to grow. But it's fine with me if the default value that someone operates at is anything for an easy life, provided they start there. And provided once they begin, they can accommodate complication as it inevitably does. The virtue of the lazy brain is that you don't invent complication. That makes life really difficult. So this aspect of human nature is something that I find sort of amusing and funny, and it's totally workable. I don't have any problem about it.
Dr. Chilton?
Yes, Bob. I mean Cantor Bob, since I'm...
Well,
yeah.
Bella pointed me the Cantor of Redwood.
Ah,
Which I'm not. But at any rate, well, two things. One, just an observation that as Jews in synagogue, we study year after year the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, in which God is very present. People believe, or some argue with him, but he's very much there. So all this later stuff doesn't enter, and our thinking enters into it. So it's kind of interesting. But I did want to ask about Immaculate Conception, if I may. What was the theory about Mary's birth versus Jesus' birth?
excellent. A good observation and a good question. On the observation side, the reason that you can do this on a regular basis in synagogue and come to know the Torah is that you've convinced yourself that work is not work. In other words, whenever a person studies, the first homework assignment is an absolute beast. And you always say to yourself, I will never in my whole life do this for pleasure. Only a fool could possibly conceive of it. I have a son who had some difficulty reading. And I'm going to do reading in school, but don't bother me at home. At 14, he started reading Dante. I don't know, and I didn't suggest it. And the best thing I did is not suggest anything. Hope this thing was going to turn itself around. And so it does. When we enter into a world which at first was totally artificial and a matter of work and hardship, we begin to feel that enjoyment that frees us up. That's also my view of worship, that worship is something that takes us outside ourselves, connects us with transcendent truth and one another in a way that frees us from all kinds of difficulty. At first, someone who worships is just confused. When do I sit? When do I stand? Why did I walk into this church? But then, over time, that becomes not only natural, but more than natural. Then, the Immaculate Conception. This was a view which initially comes to expression in the 2nd century of the Common Era in Christian writings known as the New Testament Apocrypha. And in those writings, Mary is provided with a prehistory. She's given parents, Joachim and Anne, who aren't mentioned in the New Testament. It is said that she served daily in the temple in Jerusalem making linen. Now, you who study the Torah every week know no young lady worked in the temple in Jerusalem at any time, but this was the story. The story was she was in the temple in Jerusalem, and miraculously her menstrual period was delayed so that she could continue working there as a young woman and not be unclean. And part of the same body of legend is the idea that Mary was born without the corruption of original sin. She was immaculately conceived. So in effect, the doctrine applied to Jesus was retroverted onto the case of Mary over the particular issue of sin. And you see, the fact that sin is so prominent within that entire theology shows the kind of religious system, sort we were discussing last series, not this series, the sort of religious system in which that's vitally important, because that whole question, medieval theology posed the question, how do we get out of sin? And the answer came up, it could only occur because we are extricated by someone who is without sin from the beginning. So that meant Jesus, and ultimately it meant Mary. So you see what a different doctrine it is, and how its bases are quite different from other forms of the creed that we've discussed in the past, and why it really is important to distinguish from the virgin birth of Jesus.
But if I may ask, if Mary had parents and they had sexual relations, and his mother got impregnated and had Mary, there was a sin in there?
Please, yes, another comment.
It isn't sin, it's sex that they want to get out of.
Well, yeah, we have a sin question and a sex question. Just to make the closed discussion simple and uncontroversial. Yeah.
Sex involved in either one.
Right.
And that having sex therefore must be called a sin. But
At the dawn of the Middle Ages, St. Augustine woke up one day and he had a really bad idea. This is the idea of original sin, which again, original sin is not in the Old Testament, it's not in the New Testament. It's not in the creeds, right? But Augustine felt he couldn't understand human behavior apart from his doctrine of original sin. And his view of original sin was the following: that human beings are sinful by inclination, by tendency, but within that tendency, sometimes we nonetheless do all right. But there are circumstances and conditions when things go bad, when no matter what our will might be, we become sinful. And he argued that at the moment of conception, because a person by definition was inflamed with carnal desires, it must be that original sin was passed on. That's original sin. And as I say, worst idea ever. But it's the one idea of Augustine that everyone adopts. You have a bad idea and that's the one they go for. It's like if you give a lecture series and you preface a remark by saying, I'm not sure if this is true, but I sometimes wonder. If there's an essay exam, that's what they're going to remember. So his most, and why did Augustine come up? Why was it Augustine? Why was it not Origen, the great Platonist? Because Augustine had been a Manichaean. Augustine had belonged to a point of view, his pre-Christian stage, as a Manichaean, believed in the Gnostic idea that this world in which we live represents the battle between corrupt flesh and pristine spirit. And that sexual desire is a part of that corruption. I would suggest that Augustine never stopped being a Manichaean. That is, he was continuing to import those views into his understanding of Christian theology. But yes, once you had that view of original sin, you had to have the corollary of that, which is no sex pleas were holy. Which also means that both Jesus and Mary had totally to be protected from sexuality, either in their own practice or in their birth. It comes out of that systematic concern for sin, which is now sexualized.
Wasn't Augustine a bit of a fool-arounder?
A bit of a fool-arounder. This is the understatement of the day. Yeah, Augustine was, as the British say, a lad. And he was a lad for a very long time. And like many lads, he was spoiled by his mother and went off and had a concubine and had a child after many adventures in Carthage. So when he spoke about how lust could really be destructive, he probably knew what he was talking about. But his assumption that he could apply that insight to universal humanity, that, I think, was his Manichaean move. And the Cardinal has just made his move at me, and he'll make me a Manichaean if I don't stop.